So, Miche, you and I, how did we first meet?
I booked you at Spiritland.
Indeed you did.
You were the first of our dance party, Spiritland by Night.
Yeah.
And that was at Royal Festival Hall.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because here we are, very much in this context, two generations of music lovers, loving principally a lot of the same music. So.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, that was it. You know, it seemed so fitting for you to come and join us for our first dance. You know, especially a nightclub that was built on more, you know, interesting music rather than sort of, you know, a lot of the sort of banging sound of London these days.
And I wasn't really aware of you, your kind of level of digging and then suddenly, all right, I'm going to do a compilation. And you were really very serious about this kind of mission. So tell us a bit about how you got into that thing, because the whole digging thing can be, you know, it's a little bit of an esoteric art, and I certainly said, as I've said in the sleeve notes to this, you're like a breath of fresh air, because you seem to come at it with a different kind of attitude.
That's really kind, yeah. I think the idea kind of came around when I was still in Bournemouth, sort of before I'd met sort of anyone really. My flatmate had bought the Jeremy Underground compilation that came out on Space Talk Records.
Great compilation.
Yeah, and it always seemed like this music was one step ahead of where I'd ever imagined sort of ending up really. And I think because I was sort of, my education wasn't really much back in Bournemouth, but I'd listened to sort of Floating Points and I'd been to a few nights where Floating Points and Fortet and these guys they were playing this music, which was so extreme for me back then to hear this stuff. And when I remember sort of buying that compilation from Jeremy after a friend had played it and sort of working through this sort of amazing mix of music that you could sort of play out and play in bars, and we weren't really playing nightclubs at the time, but I think we could be playing that stuff in there.
Well, I mean, obviously the Euro Melody parties that Floating Points did have been very influential in bringing this kind of sound to a new generation.
For sure.
And it's kind of interesting for my generation because a lot of the kind of music might be regarded as something that we used to call modern soul.
Yeah.
You know, whatever that meant, because I don't think your compilation is modern soul, but it's in that kind of area. Certainly, it's in the area of kind of esoteric, independent soul music that never really got the kind of exposure that it might have done first time around. But like I say, it's a new generation is approaching that music very differently, which kind of blows away the cobwebs of any kind of baggage that it might have had from the old school and everything.
And this is sort of, I like to be influenced by a lot of the things that have happened before and sort of, you know, London club culture and stuff. But I think when these guys were coming around, especially these guys who were influencing me back then, it's sort of, they didn't play by any rules really. And that's sort of, you know, it was just, and that's kind of when I found that compilation, I had in my head that I wanted to do something similar. And then, you know, kind of coming up with the concept and pitching it to Mr. Bongo was just, you know, don't sort of follow anything that sort of people have been playing, just sort of find this music that you find really interesting, sonically beautiful to my ears, and, you know, stuff that tells a story. I mean, this is all independent music that I've found the artists of, and, you know, I've gone into depths to find these people and sort of, you know, hear their story and the story behind these records that maybe they definitely didn't make it in the first time round, you know.
So, which kind of brings us round to the title of the compilation or the series, which is With Love. Now, when you're in the process of licensing music from independent artists, this is a tricky road to pursue, isn't it? Because it's not always
100%.
It's not always going to be straightforward. But the idea, I love the idea that the compilation's called With Love, and I like the idea that hopefully that you're doing everything in that process with love and showing love to the artists themselves, and hopefully, you know, they're not getting ripped off this time around, and maybe you're overcoming some of the bad luck stories that they've had in the past. Is that true of some of the tracks you've licensed?
Yeah, especially, you know, and especially sort of going to this process where I guess the idea for me was just to compile, the first one especially was just to compile a compilation of music that I really like and to share it amongst my peers. But the idea is that when you're licensing directly with the artist, that, like, you know, you feel, you know, their happiness and their joy through the music, or you feel their pain maybe of why it never sort of made its sort of impact in the first place. And, you know, a lot of hard work has gone into making these tunes that never really got anywhere. and a lot of these people kind of give up, you know, and it's sort of, you know, and I love that. My favourite kind of image in my head is me being 29 from London, calling up someone, which is sort of 2 o'clock in our morning, you know, because to hit them after they've come back from work, or, you know, later on in their evening, and they're just sort of, what's going on here? Why is this kid contacting us about you know, something that I made 50 years ago that now, you know, I've kind of almost forgotten. I can imagine
It's quite a mad thing.
99% of the people probably even forgot the name of the tune. That, you know, they might have done 1 or 2 7-inch records and then moved on with their life and got a job, or, you know, they could have written songs about, you know, a girlfriend who just was maybe a fling at the time or something, you know, it's sort of, but I like that idea of, you know, that's the with love feeling. It's like, you know,
It brings us round to this thing that I think is very true of British music culture, is in the fact that we've always been kind of curators as well of you know, certainly of Black American music, and certainly soul music has always been a huge thread through the British music culture. But like I said, when you go look at the old school, maybe, you know, in the pre-internet days, it was a very esoteric thing. I mean, not very many people knew about the records. Certainly the notion of being able to easily reach out to those artists and locate them.
Yeah.
You know, that whole thing just wasn't possible back in those days. It was, you know, it was so much further away, so to speak. Whereas now you're actually able to get involved, you know, in the process of licensing and actually making that world much smaller again. And
For sure, and there's something about kind of doing this project right now. I feel very present when I do these projects because these people are still around. They might be sort of mid to late 70s, some of them. You know, there's not much time in terms of to be able to tell their story, and it feels like doing this project right now, we sort of landed here to do this thing, and it feels so right to do it.
I mean, obviously it's quite freaky for the artists
Yeah.
to hear about, all right, so there are younger DJs playing our tracks rather than, I don't know, Earth, Wind and Fire or any of the names of big artists that that might still get, you know, a lot of recognition, but these obscure independent releases.
For sure.
You know, and obviously when you've got high profile names like Sam Floating Points championing music, it suddenly opens up a huge market for it and a whole huge audience for it, and say, all right, this music is cool.
Yeah. And, you know, and there's the kind of the digging thing, and that was probably, I wouldn't say right this second in music that's sort of a focus, but especially in the last 10 years it was people were really trying to find something that hadn't really been heard before, and you know, and
which I get, but obviously there's a problem with that in the fact that it becomes rarity for rarity's sake a lot of the time.
For sure.
It? You know, people are involved in a game where, you know, they're paying huge amounts of money for records just because nobody's got it, or because there's, you know, there were only however many pressed and things like that. It can get a little bit lost sometimes, you know, the whole kind of perspective on the music.
yeah, in a way, but trust your ears, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, the most important thing is this music, it belongs on a compilation where it's being reevaluated, recontextualized, and made available to people.
Girl, if we could get together and make it better, get together.
You've got a great passion for what you do. Do you think that this compilation is kind of different from the first one? I mean, I think it's different in terms of the energy of it as much as anything else.
I mean, my story was that I was programming Spiritland, and we were, you know, every weekend at Royal Festival Hall doing parties with some amazing artists. But my kind of always my weekly grounding was being at Spiritland, working there, buying records to listen to in the daytime, and you know, and sort of also as well, coming from a background of house music and disco music, I was trying to fill in gaps in my collection that were slightly more mellow and slightly more interesting and slightly more, you know. Whereas this time I sort of moved on from that part of my career to wanting to just play in nightclubs and wanting to play in dark rooms and, you know, with a big sound system and stuff. And the energy of this record kind of crosses over that point in my life for sure, and these kind of more aggressive sounding, like, you know, the PJ City on the record is like a heavy gospel tune, really loads of tape saturation, the vocals are like crunching in places, and the guitars are really heavy and the drums are really, you know, and I kind of wanted that as part of my development now, to show that, you know, that there's more of a dance side of it, you know.
to us to you. Keep it home.
But obviously some of those tracks, I mean, you know, they've just had a life of their own anyway, haven't they? Certainly through the whole digging network thing now, and the fact you've got this enormous democratizing thing called Discogs, which means that if their record is out there, the demands of supply and demand will determine whether this is an expensive record or a cheap record. And as a lot of these were independently pressed, there weren't that many of them to begin with, and then suddenly there's a bit of hype around it and people want it, and suddenly this record has skyrocketed in value, way beyond maybe what it's actually musically worth. But it's kind of great for the artists that they're seeing that kind of level of interest in. I had
a real issue sort of that kind of came from doing this project and meeting these artists and sort of seeing their background and stuff, that like a lot of these names became buzzwords amongst sort of friends who were playing a record, for example. You know, it felt like off the first compilation, that Alcione tune, it was like, you know, it was sort of like we were talking about, I mean, it's not the same Alcione as the main pop star, but it was sort of like, there's a human behind all these records and there's stories behind these records, and it sort of became I wanted to champion that. I really wanted to champion the fact that yes, something is rare, and yes, it becomes traded amongst friends and we love the track maybe, but we need to remember that these are artists who have told a story, and there's a reason behind they probably picked up a guitar in the first place, or they wanted to be a singer in a band. You know, they've been, some of these tracks, you listen to them, they're like massive Earth, Wind & Fire fans or huge Stevie Wonder fans, and they've gone out and they've made their own rendition of something. And we can go out and dig records and stuff, but I love the fact that every record of this I've met, and the first one I've met someone who has a story from the thing, whether it's, it's the singer, or whether it was, a producer, or the songwriter or something like that. It's important to remember that we can get so wrapped up in sort of a track and sort of its rarity and its sort of, and
it's kudos.
Exactly.
This kind of thing that builds up around it, the
exactly.
mystique almost.
Yeah, this mystique, but
you lose sight of the actual human thing, that actually somebody went in the studio and made that record, and there's a story about that. Yeah.
And and I mean, we were talking about a story with Mark Meadows off the record, and I found an article from 1992 in the LA Times of singer, tries to find his big break and giving up on, and this is like 10 years after his 7 inches come out. He's had talks with Jeffrey Osborne to produce a record, who's then gone on to do Aretha Franklin instead because he couldn't get the money. All these what ifs are so curious, and it makes these kind of a rare 7-inch so much more of an item rather than just a kind of just a tune to be played.
Your love makes me weak, and I adore you. Thinking of you, and you're so sweet.
Shall we talk a little bit about the compilation, or dig into some of the individual tracks? I mean, I must admit there were a couple of things that immediately, for me, that I loved. Which one of them is the Maxwell track, Realise, because I think I heard that at a Euromelody party, or I certainly was kind of familiar with that tune. Where did you first hear it?
I heard it through my friend Gary Johnson, who is very influential on this compilation as well. He's probably one of my favourite diggers, should we say, in terms of record collectors. He's always seems to have something that I don't quite know, and and I met Kathleen from the band, and they were really kind of insistent that they wanted to reissue their own record, and that's a great idea, and I'm really happy for them to be able to reissue it. But in terms of using a label like Mr. Bongo with a network of people who are music lovers, and it would be so their thing that we managed to put that on the compilation.
I mean, obviously you've had a while to digest all this, because you probably put this compilation together a while back, and it's taken the inevitable process up until release. So you've probably got a bit more perspective on them now than that initial enthusiasm. Oh, I really love this. I want this to go on the compilation. Sure. And now you're probably going, oh yeah, but actually this one's really come through for me now. Or
it's really hard. I mean, I'm like the whole track listing with this one, I'm really happy with. I think it's really hard to kind of pick something. They all have their own piece in my heart. It's like the Billy Boom. I love the story of you know, I kind of found him on Facebook, and the only way I kind of had of connecting with him when I initially met him was he left a review on a chicken shop in Las Vegas about a year before. So I called the chicken shop up and asked him, is this guy a regular at your store? They had no interest in talking to me and stuff. But like, we'd managed to find him, and I told him the story, and it's like all these kind of little things add up in terms of, it's more than the track, but in terms of sort of DJing out the PJ City was something that I wanted for so long, and it's something that a lot of people had wanted to have a reissue of, you know, and this was Walter Winfrey, a producer from Chicago, and who sadly passed away, but I managed to talk to his partner and get the kind of the green light to put this together. And that's just a gospel band that have done something more exceptional and slightly more different sounding than a lot of the gospel from that area. You know, Chicago's a pool of soul music, of course, but you know, this kind of sounds a bit more aggressive, a bit more kind of fun. I mean, and stuff like the Family Trees, the Julius Brockington version of Stevie Wonder, it's like, you know, you especially, you playing Stevie Wonder 2 years in a row at We Out Here, you know, the Another Star moment was still something that will live on. Yeah. And then as the following year was like,
yeah, I mean, those Stevie tunes, and it is always nice to have a great version of it.
Exactly, and that's kind of why, it's sort of why it's this last on the thing, because it's sort of every great party I've been to has ended with a Stevie Wonder track.
I suppose one thing I was just going to mention that we could touch on is the fact that for some people you might find it a bit awkward that you've got Brazilian music and then you've got soul music sitting side by side on the same comp. You know?
I've always tried, in terms of the track listing, to sort of make it make sense, and that's why the track before is sort of a bit Americana-y, a lot of kind of acoustic guitar. Well, it sounds like an acoustic guitar on this record, and that kind of maybe links it to more of the Brazilian sound. And then especially the track afterwards is, you know, it's from Chile. It sounds like an American record, but Rogers Mitchell was from Chile, and it's like, that's always why on the first one and the second one they are C1 and C2 as well, because it's got that break of, you might be sitting on your sofa listening to the record, you stand up, you take the record off, you put another on.
You're presuming that people are actually going to listen to this record from start to finish.
I'd hope so.
Which they might do.
It's a great record to cook some dinner to, for sure. But that kind of is the way it breaks up. But in terms of your original point, it's like, this is just the music I love.
The music you're passionate about.
It's like, you know.
No, totally. I mean,
it wouldn't make sense for me to put electronic music on there. Me and the label have kind of spoken about other ways of maybe introducing sort of other things for my taste. But I think soulful music, it's not soul music in a way, it's music with a lot of soul. That's what I would say is probably, you know, and those Brazilian ones, it always has to have something, because that's such an important part.
It's interesting for me because when I listen to this comp, the way I kind of hear it is I always think about the way in which people might dance to these tunes. And I was saying to you earlier, I think that what your comp does is it kind of leans into the kind of the funk and the boogie more than it does into kind of the notion of what modern soul was about, for sure, which kind of grew a little bit out of the northern thing as well. It's not that, it's, you know, it's what I call flat beat music. So I find it a bit dull personally, but I know it's all a matter of taste, you know. So is that something? I mean, obviously also as well for you, you're not really thinking about, you know, those old school idea notions of what music is or where it belongs, are you?
No, not really. I mean, there's definitely elements of, you know, I mean, living in London there's so much culture and there's so much history, rich history in this. But in terms of that, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of these tracks from, you know, these people who have played these, you know, records out before, and you know, but I try and keep this as forward-thinking as possible, really. But in terms of, you know, London's history, I mean, you probably know better than me, and sort of, you know, where this kind of music.
Well, I don't think. I mean, you know, obviously, you know, you've got loads of obscurities now which are in circulation, which probably never got played anywhere, really. You know, maybe, you know, some of these Chicago tracks would have been played on Chicago radio stations, and you know, but these tracks are not things that have had a lot of exposure up until the point when you're getting people like sampling points and that whole phenomenon of a kind of a new generation appreciating kind of esoteric soul music. So it's interesting because I see it as a completely different thing, you know, and it's neither. It doesn't really relate to those old school categories, but like I say, for me it leans into the boogie and the funk more than it does into the notions of whatever modern soul
in terms of sort
might
of
be.
the rare groove scene in London back in the day, I mean, how would you think this kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, some of it is obviously brilliant, and some of these tunes would have rocked parties if DJs had known them back in those days, for sure, without a doubt. You know.